January 24th, I went to the Durbar to visit the Emperor, who, on seeing me away, beckoned me with his hand, guiding me to not stay for the ceremony of asking leave, but to come up to him, where he appointed me a place above all other men, a place which I thought fit my honor. I gave him a small present. Having looked curiously at it, he asked me many questions about the present, and then he demanded what I required of him, and I answered, justice. Hello and welcome everyone to the third episode of our weekly podcast, India Colonized, where we bring you stories and legends from colonial past of our nation. And in today's episode, we are talking about the royal ambassador of the English court who came to the Mughal dominions, hoping to secure trade treaties, and his self-perceived importance and intimate relationship he boastfully claimed to have had with the Emperor Jahangir. Although not much was achieved of his task, however, his accounts of his stay in the Mughul Empire have provided a window into the correspondence with the Mughul Royal household and the Durbar. We are here talking about none other than Thomas Roe. The Timurid Mughal dynasty of South Asia was a source of European fascination and interest. Travelers were drawn by the promise of its riches and exotic. The establishment of links between Europe and South Asia in early 16th century brought a completely whole new era of diplomatic, commercial and artistic exchange between the two regions. And quite naturally, all of this began with representatives from Europe arriving at the court of the great Mughals, seeking their permission to establish trade agreements which would benefit their motherlands. The arrivals of the European envoy was due to the sole desire to establish factories. Now remember, when we speak about factories in the context of the advent of Europeans, we're talking about commercial compounds or fortifications that are made within the Mughal Empire or the territory that is granted to them in order to carry out trade. These factories were not manufacturing units as we would refer to them in today's world. These were mere places of storage, shipment, trading, and of commercial goods. Apart from establishing factories in the Mughal kingdoms, Europeans also wished for beneficial trade rights and safe passage for their ships on the ports of the Indian Ocean. During the early 17th century, the Portuguese had persistent presence in South Asia ever since the conquest of Goa in 1510 and the establishment of Estado de India. The Portuguese were in direct conflict with the English desire for trade relations with the Mughal. It was during the reign of the fourth Mughal Badshah, or the Emperor, Nuruddin Muhammad Jahangir, that the English consistently pressed for these desires. Among the most well-known English men to have appeared in the court of Jahangir was Sir Thomas Roe, an official ambassador sent from King James I. While he actually held the position of an ambassador in the Kingdom of England, he was also a representative of commercial entity of the East India Company. Thomas was a prolific writer. During his time in the Jahangir's court, he kept not only a detailed journal, but also pinned down letters of business and personal contacts, including the ones he wrote for King James. Roe's writings have been used to demystify the workings of the Mughal court. It has also been used to gain a window into the life of the individual personalities of the empire and the political development of 17th century Mughal dominion. His journal provides a revelation of his personality. It also reflects his frustration and antagonistic relationship with certain members of the Mughal court. Throughout his writings, Roe constantly validates his role as royal ambassador, and he stresses his position that he had been placed in the Mughal court and his self-pertained intimacy with Jahangir. To understand the task that had been allotted to Roe as the ambassador of England, we first need to know and understand the numerous failed attempts made by the English East India Company in order to establish formal trade with the Mughal court. All of it begins when a consortium of wealthy merchants was created as a commercial enterprise. The company subsequently was granted royal charter in 1600. Roe is not the first one to have represented the company. It was John Mindenhall who became the first company representative to have visited the Mughal court, and this was during the reign of Akbar, Jahangir's father. The efforts of the delegation failed, and so did the efforts of the third and the sixth voyage, until 1611. It was not until the 10th voyage that the company agreed to try again and institute a formal agreement with the Mughals. In this instance, they sent Thomas Best, not to be confused with Thomas Roe. Best was able to successfully obtain a farman, something that would mean as an order, a royal order, granting permission to the English to build a factory in Surat. However, the treaty had not been established between England and the empire. The company convinced the king to send an official ambassador to Jahangir's court. Sir Thomas Roe was chosen for this task. Roe arrived at Surat on September 1615, aged 35. A resolute man wanting to represent himself, his king, and his country in a manner that would command respect and achieve the ultimate goal for commercial agreements between the company and the Mughul Empire. Roe arrived at the royal court of Ajmer on January 1616. He stayed for 2 years before he finally returned to England in February 1619. As Roe maintained in his journal during the time he spent in the Mughal court, his writings have been published as travel writings for the enjoyment of the people who wanted to know more about his travels and the places he visited, and in such an instance, the non-European 17th century world. It is evident that Roe understood that his success was dependent on his ability to act as if he held power and position in Mughal court. We first need to understand that how much the behavior in the Mughal court was necessary, as this mission that he had undertaken had already been made difficult by the behavior of the previous company representative who had come to the court claiming to be royal ambassadors, while they were mere company employees. John Mindenhall, who we spoke about earlier, who had arrived at Akbar's court in 1603, promised the emperor that he would have a royal ambassador sent from the English kingdom. And when Hawkins arrived, Jahangir thought that he must be the ambassador who was promised, something that Hawkins was not hesitant to accept. As any royal ambassador in the Mughal court, Hawkins was accepted in the court proceedings, he was given an allowance, and he was favoured. But all of this shattered when Hawkins carelessly decided to turn up in front of the emperor while he was drunk. All of the actions of the previous company representatives had made this task of Roe much more difficult. The Mughals had now begun to laugh at the name of English ambassador, and it had come to such a moment that it had become a point of ridicule for so many, and that so many people had assumed the title, but none of them had performed the office. England's reputation as a country was of little importance to trade to the Mughals and their diplomacy. All of this became evident when Roe arrived at Surat. Roe's understanding this became even more heightened, and his belief that the impression he is going to give of himself was of utmost importance, and that this would be sought or seen as an impression of the king himself and the country of England. Naturally, this resulted in Roe engaging in politics of display and presentation, his favorite kind. He believed he was an actor in a scene, and he constantly had to maintain this character of an ambassador, and if it had to be believed by his Mughal audience. While I was reading the writings of Roe during his time in the court, there were certain recurring themes in the book. Among them, as I previously mentioned, was his position that he thought he was an embodiment of James I and of England in South Asia. Another theme of his expectation that an ambassador would be received as a special person, as with special status, and that the Mughal treatment of him should reflect the same. Thomas began to build forts in his own mind when he thought that he would be personally held in very high esteem by the emperor, and that he thought he shared an intimate relationship that no other European was afforded before. Roe insinuated himself into the hierarchy of the Mughal court. So confident and boastful about his position in the court of the emperor, Roe had his journal copied and sent it to his friends in the company and his relatives in England, even while he was still in South Asia. Once, when Thomas had arrived in the court of Jahangir in Ajmer, his writings reflect an intimacy with the emperor which he thought he had and unsurpassed by any other European. The statement portraying that the English were considered to be politically superior to other Europeans in the eyes of the emperor, even surpassing the old relationship of the Portuguese in the Mughal court, who, by the way, had existed since 1580 and who had sent their first Jesuit mission to Akbar's court. Since then, the Jesuit fathers have advised the emperor in his general dealings with the Europeans and have acted as translators and interpreters when other Europeans came to court. Roe in his writing notes additional circumstances and different situations to illustrate his importance to the emperor, including when the Badshah had sent for Thomas during the night, asking him to help him tie a sword and a scarf in the English fashion. He writes this in a letter to the company. Here, mind you, Roe is trying to show that he had an intimate access to Jahangir and that he was the only one who had been held in such a position before, and that only he could fulfill the desires of the company. All of this, he wrote to the company, was a part of a theatric role he was playing as the ambassador, trying to convince the company that he was the right person who they had chosen for this mission. Another instance when Roe writes about Jahangir. Once, when Roe was upset, Jahangir demanded to know what made Roe unhappy and that he would make sure that he would do everything in his power to make him happy. Thomas writes this too, that Jahangir respected him more than any other stranger who appeared in his court. One more instance, Roe writes favorably about how he was invited to have a drink with the emperor and his other members of the royal harem. He also stresses on how the emperor was uneased when he heard that Roe had missed the birthday ritual of weighing the emperor in gold. This depiction of Thomas thus far, which he has focused in his writing, he uses as a tool to convince his importance with Jahangir. He also writes about how he consciously placed himself in the Mughal court hierarchy. By doing so, he was trying to show that he was a person to have been of immense importance, not only in the Mughal court but also in the eyes of the emperor. Roe also writes about how he was perceived to be a man of high importance in the court. To justify this, he narrates an incident in the Durbar. The Mughal court ceremony usually dictates that when the emperor was in audience, the courtiers and the nobles were placed around the audience hall in accordance with their rank. The closest to the emperor stood close, and the high-ranking nobles stood close to the emperor. Roe was quite aware of this hierarchy. When he first arrived in January, he went to the Durbar to visit the king. He writes that the king, seeing him from afar, put out his hand, signaling him that he should approach the emperor. Now, mind you, when he is doing this, he is telling that he had to skip the ceremony of asking the emperor's permission to approach him, and that he should not be feeling shy in order to approach the imperial space. He writes that he thought this status and the emperor's action towards him was befitting to his role as an ambassador of King James I. He writes this to display his particular level of closeness that he thought he shared with the emperor, since the day he appeared in the court. The journal presents the Emperor Jahangir showing preferential treatment to Ro, stressing the fact that he did not have to formally ask permission to approach the imperial space and that he was not required to follow rigid nature of courtly audience. And as for Ro, he had already independently decided to return to the same place where he was called by the emperor on his first meeting, and that he would stand there on other occasions as well. And this had to come up. Once, during the occasion of Navroz, when Ro was invited to the audience, he chose to stand exactly where the emperor had called him to be standing earlier, next to the prince and the young Rana's side. Now, mind you, these are the spaces where the most closest of the advisors and the nobles stand to the emperor. While the emperor actually did tell Thomas to choose his own place, he personally, Ro chose to go and stand that close so that he thought he was making a statement of distinction by equating himself with the members of the royal family. Another notion of Ro perceiving himself as an important figure, important figure to Jahangir comes from an incident where a Safavid ambassador, Muhammad Reza Beg, arrives at the court. Ro writes that, like all the visitors appearing before the emperor, who were required by the customs of the court to perform a salute, something that included the taslim, that is bowing before the emperor, and followed by sajda, that is prostration in front of the emperor, 3 times. However, when Ro arrived, he requested the permission of the emperor to not use these customs of the Mughal court, but rather greet him with the customs of the English court, and just to bow a little and greeting Jahangir during his first appearance, and Jahangir allowed to do so. Thereby, Ro believed that he was ensuring that he did not have to perform what he thought was a demeaning customary act of obedience that all those who came before the emperor did by kneeling on the floor and touching their forehead to the ground 3 times. Ro felt that his decision to not perform this sort of greeting made him distinguished and more important individual from those who did perform this ceremony. Not just this, he also thought that this projected England as an equal but not a subordinate nation to the Mughul Empire. All of the acts that Ro was performing in the Mughal court were a display of how he believed England was not a subordinate to the Mughal dominion, but was rather an equal and also a partner in world politics. Ro writes a lot and much frequently about Muhammad Reza Beg, the Safavid ambassador. He writes that when the ambassador Muhammad Reza comes to the court of Jahangir, he was made to stand in the 7th rank. He mentions this particular incident to show that even an ambassador of Safavid Iran, who holds great ties with the Mughal Empire, was made to stand in the rankings close to the servants of the emperor, close to the door of the Durbar, while he himself stood near the royal princes. He also writes about how Jahangir called Shah Abbas as a brother. So when the ambassador comes and brings him a letter on behalf of Shah Abbas, and when he comes and does the taslim and the sajda and he presents the letter of the Shah to Jahangir, Jahangir asks, so how does my brother? So he writes about this incident and he mentions that Jahangir omitted the title of majesty, or giving him a title that showed him that he had a much higher position. He writes about the incidents of how he called him Shah Abbas as his brother, not as his majesty, and every time that he referred to King James I, he would do so by putting the title of the majesty. Eventually, Ro was unable to gain favors. that he was sent for and that he was commissioned for in the Mughal Empire. He saw that there was no value in staying in the court of Jahangir, while he was not able to make any strong progress on creating a formal treaty between the Mughals and the English. Roe then asked a formal leave from the emperor and received a letter from him written to King James with full of compliments and assurances of good usage of the English, and also a general firman, an order for the reception and continuation of the English in his dominion, in his country. Towards the close of September 1618, the ambassador took his departure from Surat, where 4 months he spent waiting the completion of the lading of the ship. Now, with him moving out, the question naturally arises as to what had Roe achieved so far, and had he accomplished the task which he had been sent to perform. Many writers in England have given an answer which they felt was content. They said that he had obtained valuable concessions for the English in the Mughal court, but they do not go into specifying or mentioning the nature of such concessions that were made. Roe's proposed treaty had been rejected with scorn, and he had been obliged to ridicule soon as he arrived in England, and he was told that the ordinary firmans were not even worth half a penny. After all that had affected him, what failed him were the causes that were beyond his own control. When he arrived in India, he found that the English were in a precarious position, threatened by expulsion. The local feelings which initially was in their favor was now turning against them, because of the active competition that was destroying the trade of the native merchants, and the unruliness of the sailors, added with the hostilities between the Portuguese and the English fleet in the seas, causing trouble to the inhabitants. However, his work sheds immense light not only on the events of the Mughal court, but also on the solitary walls of the Deccan, the impeding troubles in regards to the succession, and the rise of Khurram, later to be known as Shah Jahan, strengthened and supported by Noor Mahal and her family. But how was Roe and his English king perceived in the worldview of Jahangir? In stark contrast to the way Roe projected himself as an integral part of Jahangir's court, Europeans were almost completely omitted in Jahangir's memoir, the Jahangirnama. The Jahangirnama is a factual account of Jahangir's reign and an important representation of the emperor's personality, reflecting the candid individual. It goes to the extent to discuss his flaws, his attributes, his addictions, his dislikes, and even his self-designed scientific experiments. So much so that Jahangir had gained a reputation as a pleasure-loving drunk with little interest of running his empire. In fact, Jahangir names with great frequency of his courtiers, nobles, and rivals, even enemies for a matter of fact, in the Jahangirnama. And the visiting dignitaries to his court with such detail that Roe, being not mentioned in his memoir, is only breaking the perceived shield that Roe had put up, that he shared an intimate relationship with the emperor, a claim that he had made so boastfully, now with no representation in the Mughal court. Jahangir had also referred a few times to the Portuguese of the Goa. He called them as the Franks, and he referred to English only one single time, when this occurs when they were defeated in sea battle against the Portuguese. Now, even looking at this and what Thomas Roe writes, there are two distinct polar narratives that are here. And both the places, there seems to be evident bias, especially in the Jahangirnama, a bias against Europeans and the multiple ambassadors that the Europeans sent. However, ambassadors that were sent from Asian nations were mentioned quite frequently, but not the European ones. The inclusion of diplomatic visitors within the Jahangirnama was a means by which Jahangir showed the importance he had for them and the support that he gave to them. to the visiting diplomats in his court. He writes about ambassadors from various other Asian courts, such as ambassadors from Iran, Golconda, and also the very less known courts of Orange. Jahangir did not deem Roe in England worth mentioning, as he did not consider them to be political forces in the region to reckon with. He did not see them as the same politico-religious importance as he did the diplomats of the Asian Muslim nations. Sanjay Subramaniam makes a statement that the English did not appear to make an impressive mark on Mughal memory. However, during 17th century, which is quite evident through Jahangir Nama, this is contradicted by the visual evidence from the emperor's time. Two paintings created in Jahangir's lifetime indicate Roe's presence at the Mughal court, and that it did in fact have an impact on Jahangir. The first is the famous image of Jahangir preferring a Sufi sheikh over the kings, one which you will be able to see in the title image of the podcast. The same image has also been linked down in the description, so please feel free to open it up and look through it. This painting has been dated between 1615 to 1618, depicting an allegorical image of Jahangir seated upon the large hourglass, handing a book to the Sufi sheikh, watched by the Ottoman Sultan in James I, and the painter in the scene, Bishr. The portrayal of James in the painting is almost identical to the one Thomas had presented the emperor when he had met. This is something that can be directly related to Roe's presence at Jahangir's court. Scholars have argued that James I does not appear in the painting just as mere figure that had enlarged Jahangir's worldview, but as a representation of Europe, just as the Ottoman Sultan was representing the Muslim Asian world. Subordinated in his worldview, where the Mughul Empire was the political center of the world, it is evident that the image is a complete glorification of the literal title of Jahangir, which meant the word Caesar. Not Caesar as Julius Caesar, Caesar, the one who seizes. Thomas Roe's journal and letters in Jahangir Nama present contrasting views in the perception. The stark difference in Thomas's reception at the Mughal court is related with Roe perceiving himself as an important part of Jahangir's inner circle. But in both instances, the work written exhibits and has perspectives of the author's personal agenda. Not one of them can be a portrait of neutral view of their surroundings. As Thomas self-perceived his achievements and the consequences of his arrivals into Mughal court, this is not at all reflected with the Jahangir's memoir, and is quite clear from his autobiography and painting that Jahangir's worldview was the one that placed the Mughal Empire at the center of the wider political arena that encompassed Asia, and Europe was only permitted to join the arena. Thank you everyone for tuning in for today's podcast. If you liked today's episode, please consider sharing it with your friends and spreading the word. You'd really appreciate if you would also subscribe to our channel or consider following us on our social media accounts. We are available on both Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. We are also uploading our videos on YouTube, and I hope you're listening from there. But wherever you're following us or listening us to, please consider subscribing and sharing our work. Gives us a great deal of enthusiasm to work for our next episode. Thank you very much.